This week in Hey Cool, we still have national parks, I thought I'd poke around and see what are some of the other ways the national parks interact with mere regular American citizens in unexpected ways. After all, it can't all be Smokey the Bear hats on the edge of canyons. I'm sure you've heard the phrase, they don't build them like that anymore, or something similar, and in many cases it is very true. Materials updates, engineering breakthroughs, safety lessons, different priorities for America's wealthiest citizens, and let's face it, worker safety and pay minimums. But the last half of the 19th century and the first 3/4 of the 20th century did leave the U.S. with an astonishing catalog of sturdy and often airy and frankly beautiful buildings. Many of them lack indoor plumbing and electrical wiring that would make them compatible with modern expectations. Further, many of them were part of an America that was much less mobile and connected. So there was far more local investment and smaller but more locally powerful businesses distributed around the country. This combination of changes to business configuration and plumbing expectations has left many attractive and functional buildings by the wayside, watching the world change and change and change and then leave them behind. However, would you believe that the National Park Service contains the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training? This institution's beginnings go all the way back to 1986 when people looked around at these buildings being left behind, especially in cities, towns, and neighborhoods in need of senior housing, low-income housing, and, well, just quality housing generally. Because many of these buildings were built pre-electricity or when electrical power was still expensive or iffy, they were from pre-light bulb and pre-air conditioner days, so they have big windows for light and are built to encourage circulation. They are also often built of a combination of stone and old-growth timber, so are sturdy, solid, and airy in ways that new construction, due to current economic priorities, can never match. But through training and grants from the NCPTT, these buildings are being preserved, updated, and made into housing that serves the communities where these buildings were built in new ways. Bringing these buildings into the 21st century isn't as profitable as building new units, but they are more appealing housing and have far fewer major maintenance problems than their newer counterparts. I had never considered that the National Park Service, along with giving us beautiful places to visit, also helps create beautiful and comfortable places to live as well. And not just for the most wealthy, but mostly for regular people in pretty regular places. So in a country straining under a variety of housing shortages, the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training has a uniquely valuable, if under-celebrated mission. If you have an interest in impressively built spaces, look up the work of the NCPTT. Maybe you can find a place with some really nice windows and built-in closets. A link will be in the show notes. Episode 146. What was early 19th century America's problem with mushrooms? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the early American ambivalence to mushrooms and how they were kind of a food, but not really a food, but were on the edge of becoming the American version of a food. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that even back in the 1600s, when the first wave of Englishmen planted their military colony and claimed it for Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, they encountered their first American food mushrooms. And like much of the forageable food available to them, they wrote it down but decided it was not food for them. Last episode, I mentioned the Spanish encounter with South American mushrooms in the 1500s. So here we are with a second recorded mushroom encounter in the mid-Atlantic region in the 1600s. I say recorded because I find it hard to believe that the mushroom-loving Vikings didn't go foraging during their time in the Maritimes. After all, the very name Vinland shows they were checking out the foraging possibilities. But our Jamestown military dudes did make note of a substance known as tuckahoe, or Indian bread. Details are fuzzy because with this, as with many things encountered at this point, the record keeping was somewhere between lackadaisical and careless. I mean, these guys were dashing adventurers, not botanists. Like the word succotash, tuckahoe got slapped onto many items by European diarists, one of which is a large semi-firm white mushroom that grows largely underground. However, there are also tubers of water plants, along with rhizomes and corms, other root-relating swellings, that have been lumped together under the word tuckahoe. But the mushroom version of tuckahoe is a large growth produced by a fungus that grows around the roots of pine trees and was used as a food, either roasted or baked, fresh or dried, and ground and added to other stews. There were notes that other mushrooms were being used medicinally, but the remaining records are severely, yet typically, lacking in description and end up being entirely useless for identification. Much like the fate of knowledge regarding local wild greens, general disregard for local knowledge and use of mushrooms for food, medicine, and other things was both ignored and squashed flat in the quest to clear the land, find gold, and build farms. Which means American food got off to a rocky start when it came to interacting with mushrooms. I mean, they were at the perfect crossroads to be alternately ignored, overlooked, and reviled by the earliest colonizer arrivals, and many, but importantly not all, of those that followed in the early 19th century. There were 4 main psychological reasons, and one practical one, that mushrooms were way, way back in the background in early American food. Of the 4 limitations early Americans were carrying around in their brains, the first was the fact that lots of the early arrivals were soldiers and city people, so weren't super mushroom savvy to begin with. As generally non-farmers and people used to getting their food from the quartermaster, they definitely weren't the kind to even really know that mushrooms were out there for the taking. Second, even the people that were in the know about mushrooms, well, they were cautious about mushroom hunting in a new land. Knowledgeable mushroom hunters know that, well, yes, every mushroom is edible. It's just that some of them you can only eat once. I even knew that as a kid who read the original Babar the Elephant story. Good mushroom hunters do have techniques for cautious mushroom hunting, so some of them might have looked into it, and if they did, they were probably pretty conservative. But record keeping would have been mostly oral, and the people who were sorting out good mushroom from bad had the third reason, that early American mushroom hunting was minimal to secretive. Who wanted to be called a witch? During the 17th and early 18th century, parts of colonial North America were doing the post-medieval version of the Satanic Panic. Foraging for mushrooms out in the woods at the time of America's earliest history was seen along some of the same lines as hunting for herbs. Seems kinda witchcrafty. And since plenty of colonial America and early America was crawling with a sort of Protestant weirdo that was ready to yell the contemporary version of "she's a witch" or heresy, even those who started to suss out the American mushroom scene were going to do it on the extremely quiet down low, or at least stick to the least scandalous mushrooms possible. And of course, because people are going to people, they were going to repeat their old favorites. So they weren't going to neglect reason number 4, believing that foraging was a savage activity. So they tried to leave it behind to show their greater civilized tendencies. So in the end, there were people foraging, but one certainly didn't speak of it, and you definitely, absolutely did not write it down. So these were the 4 mental factors that seem to have contributed to mushrooms not really being a central, regular, up-the-middle American food in those early years. The practical physical factor contributing to all of this was that there was one kind of mushroom everyone sort of agreed on as fine, because it grew almost like a crop out in the open, in fields. But it had a very short shelf life, just a few days. So when it did show up, you ate them up quick and turned the rest into seasoning and pickles. So people were eating some mushrooms. I mean, how else did the American mushroom industry develop? but you won't find them on the menu at, say, the tavern in Colonial Williamsburg today. They were pretty edgy. And because they were so fleeting, they weren't all that visible in American food, even when they were there. And when they did show up, we weren't, as I mentioned above, into much mushroom variety. So, the mushrooms that were being eaten, why eat them at all? Which ones were they eating? How were they being eaten? And what factors would create the mushroom market that would start to bring American mushrooms into the mainstream? Okay, so first of all, why eat a mushroom? For most people, the appeal is the smell and the flavor. It's meaty. We know now that's because mushrooms are a good source of glutamates or glutamines, the amino compounds that lend themselves to everyone's current favorite food flavor word, umami. But to a regular European person of the early 19th century, that is, a non-rich one, who lived the agricultural life that consisted mostly of carbohydrates and vegetables, sort of a vegetarian diet with occasional egg and meat toppings, mushrooms were a welcome companion. Mushrooms were enjoyed in a diet that largely lacked those meaty flavors. And remember how all those holy days kept impinging into the calendar? Well, a hearty mushroom stew in the face of meatless days was certainly welcome. But in America, by the early 19th century, after 200 years or so of colonization and farm building, there was way more meat. And not just farm meat, goat, sheep, cow, pig, and also more pig. There was still access to wild game as well. Turtle, rabbit, duck, geese, passenger pigeon, deer, bear, and that bounty of fish, the mussels, the clams, and all those oysters. To your early coastal American, the choice between slowly scanning the leaf litter, hoping it was the right season for delicious mushrooms, versus traipsing down to the seashore for oysters that just sat there, well, you can imagine oysters were far more appealing. And the oysters would keep in a barrel in the cold weather right on the porch. Mushrooms, when they fleetingly appeared, had to be plucked and eaten or processed immediately. But not everyone lived near an oyster beach, and well, mushrooms do have their own unique appealing flavor. Which brings me to the first mushroom recipe almost anyone is likely to run across when researching the earliest American food: mushroom ketchup. I mentioned this as an aside back in episode 81 when I was talking about early ketchup, which was more or less spiced fish sauce. Mushroom ketchup became popular in England and then America because the earliest ketchups made in these places depended on anchovies. But anchovies are not a fish that can be caught in England or America. They must be imported, and so in cash-starved America, finding replacements for those funky, flavorful fishes was popular. Mushrooms, and at times walnuts, would fill in for the fish. It's just mushrooms were the most popular because they definitely have the meatiest smell. Walnuts are more patient. There's not a rush to ketchup them, and they don't make such tasty ketchup. Further, there are more numerous applications for preserved and ripe walnuts. In order to make a mushroom ketchup, or any 18th or 19th century mushroom recipe really, the first thing you need to do is go out and gather mushrooms. Since Americans were rather wary of the forest mushrooms for the listed reasons, the mushroom of choice for domestic American kitchen use was the field or meadow mushroom. Unlike the woodland mushrooms that are the quarry of the modern gourmet mushroom hunter, most of these written mushroom recipes from the past applied to the field, English term, or meadow, American term, mushroom. This close relative to the modern white button, cremini, and portobello mushroom, it's actually all one mushroom, likes to pop up in fields after rain in the late spring through the warm part of the fall. It is a short-lived, fairly tender mushroom. It goes mushy and flabby and unappealing in just a few days. So when they appear, it's important to go harvest them and then process them immediately. It remained an acceptable mushroom because you were able to harvest it out there in the open in a field, almost like a proper farm crop. And the American ones looked and smelled pretty much exactly the same as the European ones. and there was no need to wander off into the forest where any sort of funny business might occur. The habitat of these mushrooms is due to the fact that its preferred nutrient source is rotting grass and woody material, and horse dung contains a large proportion of partially digested grasses. So horse pastures, which absolutely dotted early America, were a favorite spot for mushroom blooms. And for what it's worth, through the end of the 20th century, it was still common to use organic fertilizers, that is, processed farm animal manure, on America's lawns. And as a result, it was not uncommon to wake up to a front yard of mushrooms. 21st century lawn fertilizers are more often factory-produced, refined versions lacking the organic material that would invite mushroom presence. So these days, unless you have the remains of an old tree under part of your lawn, you are less likely to have these or other mushrooms jump up in your yard. Anyway, the key was to go collect the mushrooms when they were either still tightly closed and button-looking, that is, when the veil was still attached to the stem, or when the gills were still a vivid pinky red. Once the gills had turned brown, the mushroom was on its way out and bound to be a little smushy. From there, it was time to clean the mushrooms. Opinions on how to do this were divided, even within a single cookbook. All of the cleaning methods advise cutting off at least part of the stipe, that is, the mushroom stem. Some advised cutting it all off, and for some, just the part that had been in the dirt. The question of whether to soak, wash, or wipe them varied. Instructions could include wiping them off with a damp or even dry cloth, or they might be soaked in water, salt water, or even a milk bath. Peeling the mushrooms before use was also an option. Because wiping, soaking, washing, and peeling were all offered as cleaning options for the same sorts of recipes, pickling, powders, sauces, and ketchups, it seems that which you did was far more personal habit and preference rather than any method being clearly superior to any other. And whether you scooped the gills out also rested largely on the preference of the cook. Though when mushrooms were collected early and young enough to be curled and closed up tight, while the stipes might or might not be entirely removed, nobody seemed to need to uncurl the mushrooms and go in and scrape out tightly closed gills. While then as now, there was some danger in confusing these mushrooms with the somewhat toxic yellow stainer and the deadly destroying angel. Experienced mushroom harvesters had little real fear of confusion, because they would know the yellow stainer by the way it turned a vivid yellow at any spot the mushroom was bruised or cut, as well as having a strong, unpleasant chemical smell like ink or phenol. Destroying angels, both white and pink-gilled, are far more phallic-looking than field mushrooms in their closed button configuration. And once they're open, they have a white frill around the top of their stipe and smell of radishes. Oh yeah, and while the delicious edible meadow or field mushroom grows out in the grassy open fields, the destroying angel is a woodland mushroom, and it has a symbiotic relationship with hardwoods. It grows in the dank and dangerous woods. So along with following her nose, a good mushroom hunter simply stayed out of the woods. Okay, so once mushrooms were plucked and cleaned in the cook's preferred way, turning them into ketchup happened in a variety of ways as well. The mushrooms might be salted, left to sit, and then crushed and stewed in their own juices with a variety of spices. After vinegar was added and the resulting liquor was reduced by being boiled or simmered down to a concentrated potion that would then be suitable for bottling. Alternately, they could be boiled in a vinegar or vinegar wine mixture with spices, and then the resulting liquid could be reduced to ketchup concentration and stored. The mushrooms would then be removed and dried in cooling ovens until they were crispy enough to be pounded into powder. Pretty soon, when beef and then chicken bouillon powder arrives on the scene, our meat-centric society would leave mushroom powder in the dust, so to speak. But at this time in history, mushroom powder lived a happy, invisible life in the background, being suggested as an additive to sauces and gravies. The meat concentrates of this era, like veal glue and pocket soup, were actually a pretty big pain to make and required much more cookery to use. Meanwhile, a quick sprinkling of dried powdered mushroom boosted the meaty flavor of even the thinnest, saddest broth or sauce. In fact, mushroom powder was so popular that while each cookbook with a mushroom ketchup recipe, or even just a ketchup recipe for oysters or anchovies that might be adapted to mushrooms, mushroom powders often appeared as more than one version. Here is a typical and very appetizing sounding mushroom powder that is very accessible to any modern cook that has access to a dehydrator, whether standalone or as an air fryer setting. The 18th and 19th century recipes are fairly large. They called for a peck of mushrooms. For those of us less acquainted with English agricultural basket terminology, that comes out to 2-gallon containers. Think of it as like 2 large American milk jugs. Out in the metric world, a peck takes up about the same space as 8 liters. Not exact, but it gives a sense of scale. Anyway, a processed and powdered peck of mushrooms would produce about a ½ pound or 225 grams of finished powder. That's a lot of work for a large double handful of powder. But on the other hand, that would likely be a year's worth of mushroom powder if you were really generous. It comes out to about 4 spice jars full of that Trader Joe's mushroom seasoning. Okay. Get your mushrooms. Store-bought is fine. Clean them your preferred way, making sure whatever you do, you cut off the tough end of the stipe. For a peck, one would have added 15 blades of mace, 40 cloves, 6 bay leaves, twice as much pepper as will lie on a ½ crown, a good handful of salt, a dozen onions, a piece of butter as big as an egg, and a ½ pint, that is 1 cup, of vinegar. Stew as fast as you can, keep the liquor for use, separate out the mushrooms from the spices, dry until they will pound to powder, store appropriately. For a modern mushroom powder cook, a dry quart or liter of mushrooms is sufficient. Though if you'd prefer just a pint, cut all the following amounts in half. For faster drying and easier powdering, roughly chop or break up your mushrooms or at least cut them in half. Use a ½ teaspoon of powdered mace or slightly less of ground nutmeg. A mere 5 cloves, splurge with 2 bay leaves. Use 1/4 to a ½ teaspoon of pepper, your choice, a tablespoon of salt, 1 small onion cut into quarters, or half a largish one, a tablespoon of butter, and a tablespoon of vinegar. The butter is definitely optional and can easily be substituted by your oil of choice. Add everything to a saucepan over medium heat to get your mushrooms to sweat out all their tasty juices. After all, mushrooms are mostly water by weight. Once it seems like the maximum amount of liquid has been released, take your mixture off the heat. Wrap everything in a lint-free tea towel and squeeze out the juice. Boil the liquid down to about half. Save this as mushroom liquor, or basically mushroom ketchup. Remove most of the onion and any large spice pieces. Spread the mushroom solids out and dehydrate them, either in a dehydrator or on a cookie sheet at about 200 degrees Fahrenheit or around 100 degrees C until the pieces are crispy. Grind up the resulting crispy pieces in a spice grinder, a mortar and pestle, or in a food processor or blender. And definitely feel free to monkey around with the spices. I've seen recipes that call for ginger, include other peppers, and some recipes don't specify anything at all other than, quote, a good quantity of spices of all sorts, unquote. So you can definitely customize this if it's appealing. The rest of the recipes were hauntingly familiar. Broiled mushrooms were just cleaned mushrooms, cooked dry over or under high heat on a griddle until they looked well cooked. Then salt, pepper, and butter were added. Stewed mushrooms were cooked over low heat with some salt, but no additional liquid. Only the liquid they sweated out. When adequately cooked, you were advised to stir in a little butter and some browned, that is, toasted flour. Maybe you could add a little red wine or sherry. But generally, directions admonish the cook mushrooms, when cooked fresh, are rather delicious. Mushroom sauce, preferred over wildfowl or domestic chicken or turkeys, was made pretty much the way the rest of the sauces of the day were constructed. The mushrooms were stewed as above, maybe with some spices, usually mace or nutmeg, but nothing too sharp, and then fat and liquid is beaten in. A mixture of butter and browned flour was typical, or butter and egg yolks would be added for a very rich sauce. The last way to preserve mushrooms and keep them around for later was pickling. That's right. If there was something tasty that was a plant, or something everybody thought was a plant, you can bet it was pickled, and mushrooms were no exception. The one part of the recipe that stood out to me was the use of milk in mushroom pickling. While some of the recipes called for vinegar or mixtures of wine and vinegar, and a recipe lifted from 17th or even 16th century sources called for alegar, that is, vinegar made from sour beer or ale rather than wine, there were also a sampling of recipes that use milk in either the preparation of the mushrooms or even in the brine. There was one recipe that specified a milk brine. All of these recipes have in common that the mushrooms were cleaned in some fashion. A few have the mushrooms salted down at the beginning to drain them. All of them have the mushrooms boiled quickly in their salted state or fresh, and some after soaking in some manner of brine. But all the versions depended on cooking the mushrooms at some stage. In no case are they given time to go through any sort of lactofermentation. The English style of cooked pickles lives on with the mushrooms, while German and Polish and Russian and Northern Asian areas all have traditions of salt pickling, the lactofermentation style responsible for the more familiar sauerkraut. The cook it and then dunk it in a strong salty vinegar way also gets applied to mushrooms in early America. So the recipe books do show that early Americans of all sorts were eating mushrooms, even if mostly as seasoning. They were there, but only in a limited way, with limited variety. America had incredible mushroom bounty. The botanists were writing about this. They knew it. But in America's ever-increasingly farmyard-centric food world, there was only one mushroom. Next episode, I'll look at how the existence of the fledgling American ice industry started to change Americans' relationship with milk and other dairy products. For among other things, America gets ice creams. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And if you do try out mushroom powder or even mushroom ketchup, let me know how your adventures went. Downloading the episode helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or that you at least find it interesting. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads, Insta, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.